Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 3 of my Empire vs. Goa'uld matchup. That is the Imperial Empire from Star Wars just prior to the Battle of Endor versus the Goa'uld from Stargate just prior to the defeat of Ra. This section will cover the widely used weaponry. I'll hold off on talking about things like super weapons and such until the unique section, and I won't be talking about every single weapon available, just a few select weapons that should give you a general idea of the power scaling on each side. Also, I have a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel, and should have some merch available soon, so stay tuned for that. As I mentioned in the intro, there's one bit of world building that I'll be imposing upon this matchup, and that is that there's Stargates everywhere there are people, not just in the Milky Way. To get around the inherent continuity issues that this causes for Star Wars, let's just assume that all the gates in the galaxy have been buried and are only now being rediscovered and researched. I'll also be making a slight adjustment to the scenario based on some of the comments I've received. Basically, after the defeat of Ra, some rather iconic technologies of the Goa'uld get developed. What they were doing in the other tens of thousands of years of relatively stagnant tech, I don't know. But yeah, I'll basically be trying to include all the Goa'uld tech with the exception of some ultra-advanced stuff that Anubis was using and things like that, since he was really more on his own side than anything. Basically, there's things like cloaking devices that were technically developed after the death of Ra. They get to use that stuff. I also want to clarify something about Stargates. Burying them is almost always an effective means of blocking them. Either this prevents them from actually establishing a connection, or the collapsing debris from the wormhole formation acts like an iris. Basically, it digs a hole, and then that loosens up the Earth so it just collapses again, and you can't materialize, so you can't get through safely. The only exception that we really get to see in the show was a gate that was engulfed in lava, which then hardened, making it so you could safely go through, but there only would be a tiny cave on the other side. And if memory serves correctly, I haven't dug into it too much, the DHD, the dial home device, wasn't even available in this particular case, so it was because it was encased in volcanic rock, so getting home in that case was pretty difficult. Alright, weapons. We'll start small and increase in scale, starting with the E11 medium blaster rifle carried by the Empire Stormtroopers. I'll gloss over most of the features and stick to basics. The E11 has a 300 meter effective range, can fire 100 times before reloading when using a standard power pack, and is, plenty accurate at any range, though the projectiles move relatively slowly, which makes accuracy hard, especially at longer distances. I'll point out here that exactly what blasters are, technically speaking, is highly unclear. They're not lasers. They don't behave at all like lasers at all, aside from bright, pretty colors. They're described on the wikis and such as being particle beams, but have none of the behaviors consistent with that description, in particular because they fire bolts, which, as further highlighted in Force Awakens, are definitely bolts, not beams. From what I can tell, descriptions be damned, they're basically just textbook plasma cannons. They even require specialized gas to operate. The way the plasma cannons work is that you take a gas, energize the heck out of it, and turn it into plasma, and then fling that at your target. This has the positive that they do decent damage. You don't need specialized munitions to match calibers or anything like that. You just pipe in gas and power to where you need it, and you just have a ton of ammo in a relatively small package as long as you can power it. The downsides are that plasma just isn't good at everything, and does almost entirely thermal damage, though there's definitely a kinetic component. They also suffer from range issues because once removed from magnetic containment, the plasma does what plasma does and begins to disperse. Other franchises get around this issue by attaching small projectiles to their plasma to maintain the magnetic field, but the ones in Star Wars don't, so their ranges are limited, and I'll get more into that later. But yeah, the fact that they're just plasma also means that there's a severe lack of versatility. If you're using an actual cartridge, you can be like, okay, this one has airburst grape shot, this one is armor piercing, this one is, whatever the properties happen to be. For the most part, you cannot do that with plasma. But again, you don't need to carry a massive armory full of explosive shells. You just have a tank of Tabana gas in this case, and a bunch of power, pipe it where needed, it works. Back to the E11. Damage-wise, they're pretty all over the place. On the one hand, you get to see them punching holes in concrete, or plascrete in this case, because everything needs to be futuristic. On the other hand, Leia can take a square shot to the shoulder and just basically need a band-aid. Clearly, though, the intent is for blasters of all calibers to be quite capable of killing people, and in real world terms, I would put them at roughly equivalent to a modern 223 rifle. Quite capable of killing people, damaging walls and such, but not penetrating heavy armor, and certainly not blowing people up. On the Stargate side, the go-to weapon for the Jaffa, the soldiers of the Goa'uld, is the Matok staff weapon. These have a comparatively short range of only 40 to 70 meters, and a staff-shaped design which makes them relatively difficult to aim. But the trade-off is that they function as formidable melee weapons, and their normal shots, which are still just plasma like the blasters, are really, really powerful. More akin to grenade launchers with no built-in shrapnel. Their output can apparently be modulated a bit to be more or less powerful, but in any case, body shots are lethal, and near misses are painful as whatever they hit near you explodes violently. Basically, the way the grenades work is they have a small explosive charge, and then they put a bunch of needles or whatever around that. So when it explodes, it sends those needles out, and those are what actually kills you. The concussion itself will hurt, but unless you're really close, that won't actually kill you. In the case of the staff weapons, they don't have the benefit of carrying any shrapnel with them, but if they hit a chunk of concrete next to you and that explodes and hits you, that'll probably kill you. So yeah, no built-in shrapnel, but they kind of make their own. Since there are really only two other weapons we get to see in Stargate, I'll mention them but not dive into them. There's the Zatnakatel pistol with its 1-shot stuns, 2 shots kill, 3 shots disintegrates, and the Karakesh gauntlet, which comes with a laundry list of features but is really only wielded by the Goa'uld system lords themselves, not their soldiers. I'll touch more on the Karakesh in the next section when I talk about defenses, because that's part of what it can do. Moving up in power, let's talk about TIE fighters and Death Gliders. TIEs use twinned anti-fighter blaster cannons, which can fire rapidly and are quite sufficient to take down pretty much any lightly protected targets, but are less useful against more heavily protected targets. Death Gliders use scaled-up versions of staff weapons, which can even be detached and carried to act as even heavier weapons than regular staff weapons. They're still fairly slow to refire, but they do a lot of damage. Bumping up to TIE bombers and Al-Kesh bombers, both have the same major downside. That is, they need to fly over their target to drop their bombs. For the TIE bomber, there's a variety of bombs they can drop, from thermal detonators and proton bombs all the way up to fusion bombs. They also have blaster cannons, but they're not turret mounted or anything like that, and bombers are really sluggish, so presumably they're not all that effective, not that we really get to see them in action. The Al-Kesh carries plasma charges, which are powerful enough to collapse subterranean tunnels, but it's hard to say what exactly they can do in terms of actual destruction. They're certainly subnuclear in yield, but beyond that, it's really hard to say. Al-Kesh also have a pair of staff cannons, but theirs are actually mounted on a turret, so they can fire away in most directions as they do their bombing runs. Finally, we can move on up to the big guys, the Imperial II Star Destroyer with its turbo lasers, and the Hatak Pyramid ship with its staff cannons. The Imperial II also has ion cannons and concussion missile turrets, but I won't focus on them too much since the intent here is to figure out whether or not the weapons on each side are actually capable of harming the other, and, basically is one side outclassed in some way. Basically, if one side can hit 100 times as hard as the other and can tank the same amount of punishment, the other factors really don't actually matter all that much because you just can't hurt them. I'll start this time with the Hatak since it'll be simpler. Each carries 60 staff cannons, and they're distributed around the perimeter of the ship, so against a single target, firing with all cannons at once is impossible, since the ship is in its own way. But that does mean that they have very good coverage no matter which angle you come at. As for the weapons themselves and what they can do, I'm just going to quote directly from the wiki because this is the kind of info I have to work with, so you all get to suffer too. Quote, "The various observed levels of firepower, rates of fire, and even projectile ejection speeds indicate that these weapons can be recalibrated at will. That is, they're way inconsistent. The maximum observed range thus far has been orbital, and their maximum firepower is unknown. At minimum, their power can be equivalent to the staff cannons on a Death Glider, as seen during the bombardment of Kalma. During the invasion of Earth, explosions were reported to be in the equivalent of 200 megaton nuclear warheads. However, judging from the fact that they take no damage from 1,000 megaton nuclear explosions, Hatak staff cannons are probably capable of several thousand megatons." End quote. In short, how much damage can they do? I don't know, a bunch. Certainly high nuclear yield, but how high is anyone's guess. Not that the assumptions made in this excerpt are unreasonable, it's just not the kind of info I prefer to depend on, especially when there's such a huge difference between 1,000 megatons with a blast radius of 50 miles and 1,000 megatons concentrated in the bolt the size of a fridge when it comes to beating down shields and armor. Basically, if you're detonating a gigantic bomb against something, most of that energy is not actually going into your target, it's being spread around everywhere. If, however, you're concentrating that all into a bolt and just hammering it away, very different level of destruction you're getting. Turbolasers, unfortunately, are even more poorly defined. What I know for sure is that their maximum effective range is 1,200 kilometers, based on the expressed range of Thrawn's Star Destroyer Chimera, corroborated by The Last Jedi, where the Supremacy was unable to damage anything in the Resistance fleet, despite their apparent spacing being only 300 to 500 kilometers, based on cannon sizes. Yay for AI as a calculator, I didn't have to do that myself. Beyond that, we run into issues regarding maximum yield. On the one side, we have Ahsoka's Rain Hellfire scene, where Chimera, which canonically doesn't have any point defense cannons, so they were definitely turbolasers, fires upon Ahsoka and her friends, and the impacts resemble rock concert pyrotechnics, not thermonuclear hell, putting their yield at approximately a couple pounds of C4 each. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Star Destroyer in Empire Strikes Back, destroying a mid-size asteroid in one shot. Previously, I've discussed this scene using fan calculations, so this time I'm going to use AI and another calculator that some fans actually built. If the asteroid in question was of similar composition to those in our own asteroid belt and was vaporized, the shot delivered a minimum of 144 kilotons of energy. If it only pulverized such an asteroid, the yield is more like 24 kilotons. So let's make it insane. Let's say that the asteroid in question was composed of tungsten, the metal with the highest melting and boiling point. It wasn't, but what the heck. In this case, vaporization would take about 6.2 megatons of energy, and pulverization would still only take 154 kilotons. So here's the part where I once again blunder into annoying the ride or die Star Wars fans. Don't get me wrong, I love Star Wars too, that's why I keep talking about it. And I've heard the same stuff as you all regarding turbolasers shooting gigatons worth of energy with every shot. The problem is these claims are based on questionable assumptions and Legends content, which, while often awesome, was just as often clearly and directly contrary to the actual Star Wars canon, which is the movies, in particular 1 through 6. Even then, everything post-Disney acquisition is questionable since it often contradicts or retcons what came before, and in all cases, Star Wars has absolutely no sense of reasonable scale. Oh, you thought the Star Destroyers are big at 1,600 meters long? Well, the Executor is 19,000 meters long. Oh, you thought that was big? Well, the Supremacy from The Last Jedi is 60,000 meters long. Well, wide. Yeah, the scaling in Star Wars is just absolutely ridiculous. Speaking of Disney Star Wars, though, that's where we get an actual example of orbital bombardment on screen. Fortunately, it's a scene that showcases some phenomenal levels of destruction. Unfortunately, it's from The Last Jedi, which I consider to be the single worst movie in the series, though there's some pretty stiff competition with Rise of Skywalker. Anywho, we get to see the First Order Dreadnought Fulminatrix use its orbital autocannons, which are specialized for orbital bombardment, and I think it's pretty safe to say are more powerful, if more unwieldy, than turbolasers. So it uses those cannons to blast the Resistance base completely off the map. Again, I fed this to AI in an optimistic attempt at getting some more hope, and the result, assuming the Resistance base was vaporized, is 6.2 megatons. And here's the part of the video where I plead with my audience to provide some actual information from canon sources that would indicate higher energy output. The asteroid destruction scene gets pointed to a lot, and I even went ahead and went to stardestroyer.net, where some superfan made a calculator to give the amount of energy needed to blow up an asteroid made of granite, ice, or nickel iron, and I didn't even get into the gigaton range for vaporization until I plugged in an asteroid with a 0.5 kilometer diameter. Roughly a third the size of an Imperial II, far larger than anything we see destroyed in that sequence. And that's assuming that the asteroid we see was actually vaporized. If it was just pulverized, we don't approach gigaton energy until we get into the 10 kilometer diameter asteroid, so half the size of the Executor Super Star Destroyer. But actually far larger than the Executor, since that would be a sphere of that size, not an arrow shape. Granted, the calculator only incorporates fragmentation energy needed for igneous rock, so it's a little goofy, but it's what we've got to go off of. But yeah, some guy in some novel throwing out a gigantic number isn't good enough. Heck, if you all can ask AI yourselves, just in case Microsoft Copilot is lying to me and the StarDestroyer.net calculator is broken, that'd be great too, because as things stand, if we don't get a few orders of magnitude added onto the yield of turbo lasers, they're going to be literally incapable of damaging Goa'uld ships at all. At least if we assume that the Stargate fans are actually correct and Apophysis shields tanked a 1,000 megaton or 1 gigaton strike with 0 damage sustained in the Season 2 premiere. Yeah, I went ahead and rewatched the episode just to be able to get eyes on it myself. I have my own thoughts, but that's for the defenses section. Funny enough, part of the reason I actually chose this matchup is because I figured that the Empire would just totally thrash the System Lords, and with all their Star Trek versus Star Wars stuff, and I've been kind of antagonizing the Wars fans, I kind of wanted Wars to actually get a solid win, but then I started doing the research, and if nothing changes, this matchup is going to be over before it even starts. And then I'll have to do another matchup of the Goa'uld versus the Federation, seeing if they could even take them on. We'll get more into it with the defenses section, see if the Goa'uld are actually as durable as people think they are. I haven't done all the research on that yet, so we'll see. In any case, I always defer to data, not vibes. If I get feedback that is basically, or if I find articles or whatever, they're like, well, it feels like they must be doing around this much damage. I don't care how it feels. I care about, oh, well, they actually did this in this one episode or whatever it happens to be, and therefore they can do this. That is compelling to me. Vibes, not so much. And with that, I'll wrap this one up. Again, please comment if you have any solid info that could change things up a bit. Also, there's a coffee link in the description, and I promise there will soon be merch available. Some friends actually took it upon themselves to design some stuff for me because I had a birthday recently, and they're like, here, present. I'm like, sweet. And yeah, they're masters of puns, and they're fantastic, so I'm looking forward to that. But until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.